You know what video games are synonymous with? Violence. I'm talking hack 'em up, shoot 'em in the head, and ground pound them out of existence, baby. No, but really, video games are largely a combat gameplay experience. Sometimes it's more viscerally realistic violence, like getting into a gang fight in Grand Theft Auto, or simply stomping the head of a cartoonish character in a Mario game. As far as engaging action, it makes sense that fighting things is one of the core elements of playing a game in the vast majority of games. And largely, games were targeted at younger male demographics back when they were up and coming. I mean, it's no big surprise that the medium became popular off of some angsty teenage energy, wanting to take aggression out in some kind of healthy outlet. As a direct result of these simulations of violence, however, we got some of the most iconic characters. And with these characters came yet another iconic element: their weapons. Weapons are an extension of the character's actions. They can make the experience a godlike power fantasy, and the lack of them can make the character feel vulnerable and powerless. Sometimes the characters themselves are the weapon. I just wanted to take a quick second to highlight an appreciation for how video game weapons add to the immersion of a story, and how making weapons less special in the combat experience of a game can make the game feel a bit more vapid. Of course, something that is vapid is lacking some meaning, so what gives a weapon meaning in the context of a game? Well, weapons in games are only as important in the player's psyche as they are to the progression of combat ability they provide. Think about any MMO that you've played. The addicting aspect of them is the RPG elements. And what makes RPG elements addicting? Well, getting better gear and combat abilities. There's nothing like the discovery of something that can boost the ability to complete tasks and get those little dopamine hits in the game. When a player creates a character in RuneScape, for example, they are basically given some base level weapons and a shield. When they enter the actual starter server experience, though, they can see other players with armor upgrades and better weapons. This instantaneously motivates the player to get better and to gain better tools to complete tasks. Much of the resource gathering comes from combat in an MMO like this. In order to intensify the significance of weapons, usually some kind of visual indicator is attached to the weapon to make it more appealing as well. Instead of your standard metallic colors, the higher level weapons are more vibrant and colorful. Eventually, they even take on a more defined and unique shape, to the point where even after 20 years of playing the game, you still view that dragon scimitar as a status symbol. And then you level up your new account years after your childhood one in order to complete the quest to get it and hold it with pride. Meanwhile, you have players that are actually good at the game telling you to get some real gear if you ever want to raid, you silly little noob. MMOs are unique, however, in the sense that there is an ongoing status to your character's combat levels, and the items that come along with that. Taking away the social element, you can still have this feeling of progression through upgrading your weapons, but there's still a comparative element of where you are in the game based on what kind of weapon you have. You can see this in games like The Elder Scrolls and Grand Theft Auto, but along with leveling up your character, you have to level up the tools that you're using to become a more effective force in the world. This is by its very nature competitive, and that is by no means the only reason that weapons in video games are both iconic and important. In most single-player experiences, weapons are a lot less disposable on average. A lot more games in recent times have taken on those RPG elements of getting better gear over time, but the weapons that really stick in our brains are the ones that really helped us progress with a limited tool belt of weapons to use. In fact, the less a weapon has to compete with other weapons, the more you can appreciate it. The quintessential example to point to is of course the Master Sword in the Legend of Zelda franchise. You get maybe one or two options for swords to use before receiving the Master Sword, but once you get it, it's the best sword to use. Considering the mechanics of the combat are generally centered around swordplay, This makes receiving a more powerful core weapon a special experience. The fact that you have to work up to that point, though, still highlights the progression element that makes the accomplishment special. You see this in Kingdom Hearts as well, where there are better types of keyblades to use, and the visual distinction between them makes them iconic, and each is interestingly unique from a lore perspective. That progression doesn't even need to involve swapping out an old weapon for a new one, though. Sometimes it means adding to the arsenal, or editing the weapon that you already have. In the newer Star Wars Jedi games, you get an update to combat styles and lightsaber appearances. It doesn't change the fact that you're still using the same weapon, but how that weapon is upgraded will drastically change the style of combat. This was a built-upon concept when it came to lightsaber-wielding combat games of the past, however. In the Force Unleashed games, you could also upgrade your lightsaber in the form of crystals to change the aesthetics, but you could also use it to power up your character. But going back even further, in the old Jedi Knight games, they took on more of the arsenal approach that I was talking about earlier, where you had the option to use a tool belt of different weapons, but the core weapon was still your lightsaber. This is personally my favorite system because the core gameplay feels instilled in the experience. The developers can create a very polished combat experience that's tied to a specific weapon, or even just a few weapons. Turn-based Paper Mario is a great example of this as well, where you have the ability to jump and the ability to use your hammer, and throughout the game you can upgrade those two abilities, but it still is your primary source of attack, unless you want to use some secondary item or a partner ability, but for the core character it is their primary attack. And ultimately, there is something to be said for a more focused experience in games, especially when it comes to enemy and boss design. When you have one weapon that's designed for those enemies and bosses, it's usually a more tight experience. Going back to the example of the old Jedi Knight games, in the game Jedi Outcast in particular, the lightsaber felt special because you play through the first fifth of the game without one, and then mechanically the game would change dramatically when you had the ability to do close combat and play more offensively. This made you feel significantly more powerful, and your ability to use that tool would intensify with your growing force abilities throughout the game. Arsenal gameplay really became a focal point in the 6th and 7th generation of consoles. Combat variation was starting to be an experimental aspect of shooters in particular. I was replaying Jak II recently, and it is basically the epitome of this concept. The whole progression of the game is built upon you getting more guns to help in the growing combat challenges in each level. You start out with a close-range shotgun basically, and work your way up to an explosive big gun, with a couple of machine guns squeezed in the middle. It's an incredibly simple arsenal compared to many games that have come since, but a very satisfying progression that makes you feel as though you've accomplished something throughout the adventure. First-person shooters like Halo, BioShock, and Far Cry had a variety of different guns that would appeal to different playstyles. Grand Theft Auto and Saints Row games had a wheel of different options. This would allow players to feel more of a power fantasy in the amount of damage they were able to cause, but it still kept that progressive element of adding to your arsenal over time. Some of the most memorable parts of Grand Theft Auto games were the early parts of the game, where you had limited access to weapons at all and had to engage in a mission with nothing more than a handgun. It really created an immersive experience of becoming a more significant badass as the game went on. Unfortunately, I believe that this concept was what led to a more vapid, oversaturated weapon fatigue in the gaming culture later on. The pivoting point that I can think of specifically was when Borderlands 2 advertised that there would be thousands of different guns with different abilities tied to them in the game. This novelty would unfortunately become kind of normalized as a standard for first-person shooters, especially as they became more competitive online experiences. and we started to see online first-person shooters become more like MMOs in that sense. One of the biggest offenders of this was Destiny, where you'd continually be throwing out your old weapons for a new, slightly better one. Luckily, they eventually added an upgrade system for each individual specialty weapon, but it was pretty deep into the game's existence before that became implemented. And it still took away from the progressive element of having that specific weapon that had a set amount of power and ability when they did that. Grinding gear rarely feels that special when you're constantly having a new trinket dangled in your face that just so happens to be more visually and functionally interesting than the best option that you had previously before the last game update. I mean, why do you think people go back and play classic WoW instead of retail, huh? It couldn't possibly have anything to do with feeling a sense of progression from the very beginning of the game and enjoying the process of getting new gear along the way and knowing where that grind comes to an end, could it? The last kind of game I wanted to talk about was the one that utilizes one weapon to solve a variety of problems. One could dispute whether these things are technically weapons or not in some cases. Usually they're more like tools. However, they're generally your primary source of fending off enemies or avoiding them entirely. So I'm going to count them as a weapon for the sake of the video. This type of game is a lot less common these days because variety is the spice of life, as they say. However, variety can take on the face of level design and puzzle design as well. The Portal games would be a pretty good example of this, where you technically only have one tool to both progress and eliminate obstacles. If there's a turret in your way, you can drop a box on it from a portal in the ceiling, but the main point of the gun is generally to get yourself from one place to another. In a similar vein, Flood from Super Mario Sunshine is a bit of a multifaceted tool as well. It works as both a transporting device for Mario, but you need it in order to remove obstacles from your environment and defeat certain enemies. This encourages a more problem-solving approach to gaming, and breeds a lot more creativity. This type of gameplay is important, because I think it actually exercises the brain of the player a little bit more than a game that just tells you to get a bigger stick, basically. It also puts more of an emphasis on level design, which I think is what actually makes a game more engaging. When you're sucking up ghosts in Luigi's Mansion, you are able to progressively get better at using the Poltergust, and are more focused on how to get the ghosts into the position to suck them up, rather than just going guns blazing with whatever arsenal of weapons that you would have otherwise. In this case, I guess just Mario Brothers fists and feet, but anyway. This type of puzzle solving can also happen in games where you have a bit of an arsenal, like Zelda. But in specific cases of puzzle solving, it is often tied to one particular item that you have to utilize for a specific level or dungeon. Overall, this makes for a very iconic tool that people feel much more attached to throughout the gaming experience, or at least throughout that level or dungeon. And when you see the potential solution to a problem because of a previously solved problem, it is very gratifying. Overall, I just wanted to take a second to talk about weapons in video games, because they are iconic and incredibly cool at times. Whether it's Dante's over-the-top twin pistols in Devil May Cry, or Sora's Keyblade in the Kingdom Hearts series, or even an iconic weapon used by an NPC, like Arthas's sword Frostmourne. Weapons represent a call to action and the will to fight. When you're able to embody that, it creates an immersive experience where you as the player become a character and take on the responsibility of fighting your way to a specific goal. And if something's not worth fighting for, is it really worth anything? As always, guys, hope you enjoyed the video, and feel free to like and subscribe if you did. Feel free to leave me a comment about your favorite video game weapons below. And thank you for coming to the Dutch Ritz party.